Yes, I wasn't sure what to expect and how this would take place, so I didn't prepare any slides. But I have a very simple point to make. So I'm a cellular neuroscientist, and I have a personal bias, which is that I think we need to have if we want to understand how the brain works or get sick, at some point we need to develop a mechanistic understanding of what happens at the cellular level. And I think cognitive neuroscience level models that kind of conceptualize the brain as big areas talking to each other are not sufficient to really understand how the brain works. I'm willing to be challenged on that, but it's a personal, professional bias, let's put it like this. Now we've heard a lot of talk about neurons, how much compute do we need to simulate all the neurons in the brain, how do neurons communicate to each other. There was a great presentation from Mitya about reconceptualizing neuron models as different kind of dynamical systems that we've been used to so far. But in fact, in all of these presentations, there's one thing we didn't hear about, which is the other half of the brain, which are glial cells. Now, if you're not aware, there's about 170 billion cells in your skull, and half of them are not neurons, okay? And it gets worse, so to speak, when you look at the cortex, where we think all the cool stuff is happening, where actually these glial cells, they outnumber neurons by a ratio of about 4:1 or a bit less than 4:1. So it means 80% of what happens in your cortex, we have actually very little idea of what it does. And I think that this is a challenge for this community to consider for two simple reasons. The first one is that for historical reasons, these cells have been not as extensively studied as neurons. And we don't really have a computational models or an idea of what kind of computation or if any kind of computation they would do in the brain. But in fact, there is accumulating experimental evidence now that they do contribute to decision making, that they do contribute to disease mechanisms, that they do contribute to various other processes. So you cannot, and so this vision of the brain as just a very large neural network is, I believe, completely inaccurate, right? Because you are actually ignoring, if we speak about the cortex, 80% of the population. So it's not a very diverse and inclusive view of how the brain works. And these cells, they pose a number of challenges because, as I said, we don't have, so first of all, glial cells is just an umbrella terminology, again, for historical reasons. It's actually many different subcategories of cells that are very distinct from each other and that have different functions. And they don't seem to be doing all or none or binary computation like neurons, so they don't generate anything like action potentials. But if they contribute to computation in the brain, they do it in a more analogous fashion, probably. So I guess it poses an entirely new set of challenges if you want to emulate the brain one day. The other thing is that they are structurally plastic for some of them, so they move a lot. They have branches that they extend and retract, which means that the idea that you can just digitalize the brain as a static structure is probably quite inaccurate. And so that's the only thing I wanted to communicate today, that I think that if you want to go into that direction, you have to really consider this other component of the brain, which is actually the majority of the population in the cortex, for which we have much less experimental data, no real computational framework like we have for neural networks at diverse complexity levels. And that is a huge area of progress to come in the neurosciences for the next decades. That's it.
Wonderful. Okay, why don't we go around?
Okay, so I was wondering about the processes that are known that glia facilitate computation-wise, and how generalizable are they? Are they something that you can, in your opinion, build a generalizable model that can sort of cover different types of glia as based on, okay, this glial cell expresses certain genes, and so it must facilitate synaptic transmission in this way by, I've heard some glia can sort of glom onto the sides of synapses and help with computations? Or is it like just so diverse in terms of what they do that it's really hard to pin down something?
No, so there's a few distinct subcategories that have relatively well identified roles. the question, I think one question is within each one of these subcategories, we would assume that you could generalize to a certain extent, but there is data simmering under the surface that there is also a certain type of regional diversity within these subcategories. We don't really have an answer to that. So for now, the basic assumption would be, I don't know, there's one category are called astrocytes. You would think all the astrocytes are the same, but this is probably likely to be revised in the decades to come. Yeah. And it's true for other subcategories. There's just a paper this week, I think, that showed there's a subtype of microglia, which are immune cells that are specifically responsible for certain cognitive processes. Now I can't remember which one, but which suggests that there is already a differentiation within that, what we consider one cell population. There's already two distinct types that do different jobs, possibly.
Efforts like the Allen Institute's cell typing kind of thing for glia as in addition to neurons?
I don't know. Usually when you Google cell types in neuroscience, people mean different types of neurons. So, and that's probably 99% of the publications you're gonna find there, because there's a well-identified diversity among different classes of neurons, right? And that have been studied for way longer than here.
Unfortunately, we have to leave it at that. Okay. But I want to challenge.
My challenge: develop a computational framework for glial cells.
Develop a computational
Framework for glial cells, for non-neuronal cells.